can't see me, you Stevie. Wondering how I reach more evolutions than Eevee and make it look easy.
What is up, Earth's mightiest subscribers? It's Ernie, the Blerd without fear. Welcome back to the channel. Before we get into today's video, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tap that notification bell. That way you don't miss any of my videos. And also hit that like button because it really helps me out in the algorithm, keeps this video in front of more people just like yourself. Today's video, we're going to be talking about That's right, the Energon Universe's G.I. Joe series is finally launched. We've had a few different series to kind of pad us out to build and pave the way to this new G.I. Joe series. And while I will say, yeah, let's go ahead and get this out of the way because almost every time I put out a G.I. Joe related video, someone asks this,
well, does this have anything to do with the G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero story arc? Why are they changing all these things? None of this has happened in G.I. Joe, Real American Hero.
Well, as it turns out, this has nothing to do with that. This is, as I said earlier, this is the Energon universe. It has nothing to do with G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero. That said, you can still check out G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero at Image Comics just the same as you can with this series. It's just that they aren't connected in any way, shape, form, or fashion other than sharing the same name, minus the subtitle. Not only that, this is a G.I. Joe in its infancy. In the Energon universe, G.I. Joe did not exist until General Hawk put it in motion. And to the same tune, neither did Cobra. But now, Cobra does exist. In the wake of both Joshua Williamson's Duke and his Cobra Commander series, now both organizations are on the rise. Cobra is a bit further ahead than G.I. Joe, and they're gonna prove how much further they are in this issue. But I don't want to get into that just yet. I really want to set up this G.I. Joe thing because it's already stated. We've had Duke, we've had Cobra Commander, we just recently had the Scarlet series that just wrapped up, and the Destro series that also just recently wrapped up. And by the time you get to the end of both of those series, both G.I. Joe and Cobra are a lot further along than what they initially were. And by this particular point, G.I. Joe is now ready to take on his first mission. Now, the question becomes, who is on this G.I. Joe team? Well, first off is going to be Duke. Of course it's going to be Duke. It's always going to be Duke. Duke is the quintessential leader of G.I. Joe. He is one of the, other than Snake Eyes, he's the most recognizable member of the team, and he's probably the one most people know without even having to think too terribly hard about it. But yes, Duke is the team leader. Now, granted, General Hawk is calling the shots, at least, from on high back at Washington. But G.I. Joe, as far as in the field, is under Duke's command. And we also have OG G.I. Joe characters like Rock and Roll, who is going to operate as the team's heavy artillery specialist. Also, yet another original G.I. Joe, Stalker, who will be the team's communications and infiltration specialist. We also have CoverGirl, who, oddly enough, an OG G.I. Joe member, but also a character who was not used very much outside of the original A Real American Hero comic series. Of the female Joes who were more prevalent on the series, between Scarlet, Lady J, and CoverGirl, CoverGirl was always the one who was just chilling back in the cut and not really doing anything. You had to dig into the A Real American Hero comic series to really see much of anything from CoverGirl, but this is one of those instances where she's actually getting to do a lot more. And specifically, being one of the team's assault specialists, as well as being the team's engineer. We also have another OG G.I. Joe character, Clutch, who is basically the wheelman of G.I. Joe. While yes, CoverGirl is building the tanks and vehicles and things that they're going to be rolling around in, it's going to be Clutch who's behind the wheel. And last, and most certainly not least, is going to be Baroness. Now, if you've not checked out my video for Duke, I actually recommend go check it out up here. But you go back to that series, Baroness was introduced, and this is a very different Baroness than what we might be used to. This is not a Baroness who is working for Cobra. As a matter of fact, right now at this particular point in time, she doesn't really seem to know Cobra is really much of a thing. Like, her encounter with Cobra was in the Duke series, and it was a Cobra that wasn't even really Cobra just yet. It was still the early beginnings of Cobra. She doesn't have any prior relationship with Cobra Commander or Destro, at least it doesn't seem to be the case, and she seems to be more morally ambiguous of a character, though she is recognized as a war criminal. This is something that didn't just come up in this series, but also came up in the Duke series. She was already in prison when Duke was incarcerated by the, I guess what you would call the proto G.I. Joe era in the Duke series. And here what they're doing is they're kind of playing up this angle where they're trying to give Duke and Baroness more of a connection. Something that was not really present in the original animated series, much less the comics, at least the early goings of the comics as I remember them. And I would also dare say it is almost kind of more similar to what they did with the G.I. Joe live action series, but in that they tried to make them family as opposed to making them romantically linked. But here they're trying to have this will they or won't they with Baroness and Duke, and it's not really played up as much here, except for like in the early pages of it, but as you go along, you're probably going to see that come up a lot. Baroness is basically the person on the team who her character could go one of a couple of ways. She could either be the war criminal with a heart of gold who will eventually warm up to the Joes and become a productive member of the team, or will hang around just long enough to realize that Cobra has the upper hand and will eventually just leave the team, probably ditch them at their darkest hour, which honestly, considering the trajectory of this story arc in just the first issue alone, it seems like that moment might be sooner rather than later. Just kind of a guess here, I'm going to assume that Joshua Williamson is not going to have Baroness turn tail quite right away, if ever. Now, I mentioned all these other characters. There's another one that you actually see on the front of the cover. You also see inside this issue named Risk. This is a new character by my understanding, and Joshua Williamson's attempt to inject a little bit of new blood into the series, which, to be fair, I almost kind of feel like G.I. Joe has so many characters you don't need to make any new characters, but honestly, I don't envy the task of Joshua here because G.I. Joe, while it has a lot of characters, it also has a lot of white characters. G.I. Joe can very easily be one of the most white books you ever read, just based on the fact that most of the characters, and I would actually dare say 95, and I'm being generous when I say 95 here, and when I say generous, I mean I'm being kind in saying that it's only 95%. I think it'd actually be safer to say 98% of most G.I. Joe characters are white. So yeah, he's trying to inject in something that, wasn't there before. And while yes, there are other characters you could introduce, one can make a case for characters like Heavy Duty, Roadblock, Spirit, or Quick Kick, but we'll just have to wait and see what happens with that. Point of the matter here is that Risk is new. We don't get to spend a lot of time with him, but it seems like his whole thing is being a pretty boy who can throw hands with the best of them, seems to really enjoy cage fighting and talking trash. I like the guy already. So what is the big deal here with this G.I. Joe series? Yes, it's G.I. Joe's first mission, and that's all well and good. We can see a lot of the team drama, but what's going on with Cobra? Well, as it turns out, Cobra, as I've talked about before, they have been using the Decepticons to mine Energon technology. More specifically, they were mining Megatron for this technology, but he's gotten away. But before all that could happen, Cobra Commander had already gotten most of the information he needed and the knowledge of how to mass produce Energon, something that the Decepticons would really like to get their hands on right now. And while the Autobots need Energon just as much as them, they're also terrified of the prospect that humans have already figured out how to mass produce the very thing they need to stay alive. Taking all that into consideration though, Destro has finally come up with a new weapon for Cobra that actually manages to impress him. You see, over the course of the Cobra Commander series, well, as you would imagine, especially from the comics and the original animated series, Cobra Commander and Destro don't like each other very much. This is a marriage of convenience by every definition. At the end of the day, Destro also wants to take over control of Cobra for himself. All in all, he's still going to make himself useful until Cobra Commander is no longer useful himself. And what he has done is that over the course of the series, you probably noticed, especially if you've been keeping up with the Energon Universe comics, we haven't really seen those iconic laser rifles that the G.I. Joes and Cobra Commander operatives often use. Well, as it turns out, this is something that is a kind of a sticking point for Baroness early on in this issue, is that G.I. Joe is operating with outdated tech. They're using outdated mechs, outdated tanks, outdated jetpacks, and they're using regular guns. Meanwhile, Destro has figured out how to create the iconic laser rifles we often used to make fun of in those G.I. Joe cartoons because no one ever really seemed to land a shot. Well, let me tell you, in the Energon universe, Cobra operatives are way better shots than what you would imagine. And yes, they are able to land hits. And while technically, yes, the Joe should have these guns too, they're trying to get their hands on Energon technology in order to maybe possibly create some of these. But we've already seen what might be potentially the first casualty among the group, and that is Rock and Roll. Rock and Roll tries to take one for the team, thinking that these laser rifles aren't as deadly as he initially had imagined. Well, Rock and Roll can tell you firsthand exactly how deadly and devastating those laser rifles actually are. So far, just one issue in, the series is off to a great start. I actually do highly recommend, if you've never checked out the Energon Universe one-shot, I highly recommend you do that because there's a lot of setup. I don't want to say a lot of setup, but there's definitely a little short story that's in that one shot that'll give you a little idea of what all to expect from the series. But yeah, it's cooking. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you're not reading the Energon Universe comics and you consider yourself a fan of G.I. Joe or Transformers or both, yeah, you're doing yourself a disservice. And so I highly recommend you get in on this. This is one of the best comics coming out each and every month, whether it's the various different G.I. Joe spin-offs or Cobra spin-offs or the Transformer series or the other spin-off series that really I don't see too many people talking about, but is definitely a good series. You're going to hear me talking about it some more here before too long, and that's Void Rivals. So if the question is whether or not G.I. Joe lives up to the hype in the Energon universe, I can promise you G.I. Joe is there.